All right, guys, welcome back. Now, if you followed the journey so far on this project, we've covered the door lock switch, we've covered the door window switch, the traction control in the center console, we've covered on the headlight switch. We've got two sets of switches left, okay? And this is where things are going to get tricky. We have our left switch in our steering wheel, and we have our right switch in our steering wheel. Now, why is this? It's tricky for two reasons. The first reason is that the wires are not straightforward. The wires need to go through your clock spring. I've done the diligence of deconfiguring and looking at what are the actual things that go through the clock spring, the connector that connects to the wiring harness behind the dashboard, and then the mini harness that sits inside your steering wheel. Now, when we think about it, those switches actually already have an LED, right? And it's the ice blue LED. That LED is driven by a light and a ground, right? So if you look here on the screen, we have our switch illumination, which is essentially the feed to those LEDs, and then we have the ground. Now, the issue that we have is that, and you're not seeing it here, but the clock spring, in order for us to do this, right, we need to have 4 vacant slots. We need to have a ground, and we need to have a red voltage or ground, a blue voltage or ground, and a green voltage or ground, right? If you're going to use RGB LEDs, you need to have at bare minimum 4 empty slots. Now we can consume 2 of them here, right? Because you have your voltage for your ice blue, and you can just borrow the ground from the rest of the system. The issue is that on the clock spring, we don't actually have that extra space, right? We only, on the clock spring, and I'm just going to actually look for this here. I started a project where I was going to attempt to put a heated steering wheel in, and in order to do that, you need to understand your clock spring better. If I come down here and we look at the clock spring, unfortunately, the connector that's in the dash only has 1 vacant slot. So in theory, you could put a 2-color LED, right? Because you would use your illumination line here, which is 7. You could borrow your ground here. And then you have this 1 vacant not used slot, 2. And you could put a color there, right? So why is this complicated? It's complicated because in order for us to perform this in the steering wheel, we're going to need to add wires to the clock spring. Now, I'm not going to get into that right now because that's something I haven't explored yet, but it will come in a later episode. I did find a solid explanation for someone who actually did add wires to the clock spring. I gave it a very, very brief, view. It doesn't seem that complicated. It's just you need to get a ribbon cable. It needs to be wired. You need to take apart your clock spring. You need to run it through. It takes a pretty solid understanding of how a clock spring works in order to add it in. Again, I'm not going to get into that now because that's only complication number 1. Getting back here to complication number 2 is the fact that up until now, we've only really had to replace 1, maybe 2 LEDs inside of our components. The window switches, the lock, they only used 1 LED. So it was really easy to get those osmium LEDs into the housing. The traction control used 2, and even the light switch used 4. But the light switch housing is massive, right? We were able to kind of desolder those LEDs, remove them, fit those in, and it still worked. The problem with the steering wheel switches is that they are tiny. And the LEDs on them are even smaller. They're, I want to say they're about a quarter of the size of a pencil eraser. Those Osmium LEDs are not going to fit. I've already taken apart my switches and done some work on them, but I think it's important for me to show you the images. This is your switch taken apart, right? Taken apart here. Here's the top. Here's the rubber piece. This right here is your LED. And these are, let's call them smoothing capacitors. Here are some resistors for these bottom LEDs. The resistors for these are on the back side. But for perspective, the Osmium LED is like this big. There is no way to fit that on this switch. And honestly, it's not terrible on this. I wouldn't want 4 LEDs on here from Osmium, which would actually look pretty terrible, but it's probably doable. When we get into the left switch, honestly, things get even worse because you actually have LEDs that are in between the button pads, especially this one that's in the middle. There's no way you're getting the Osmium LED in there. So what do? We have to find a way to get around the fact that there are these LEDs in the middle, and how are we going to manage that? Well, I did some brainstorming, and I got an idea from a mod called the Flippy Drive. I'm not going to get into what that is. You guys can Google it if you want. But essentially, what I thought of was, what if we use a flex ribbon cable and we turn it into what I would like to call something like a sheet on your bed, right? You have your bed. Think of your bed with a blanket on top. The blanket on top is this rubber pad right here. The bed is the actual circuit board. What if we had something that was so thin it could fit in between these like a sheet on your bed? And what I decided to do was I use a system called KiCad. And I mentioned this in one of our earlier videos. But in this, I determined, what if I can design a flexible PCB that is thin enough to sit over it and actually fit in between? And here is what I designed. So if you look here, and I will see if I can rotate this, maybe. Nope, cannot. So you guys will just have to bear with me. What I did was I designed a RGB system that would allow me to actually have the LEDs sit on this flexible cable. Now these circles are the holes that allow the pads to fit and go through. When you press the buttons, go through the flex ribbon cable. Now this may be a little hard to imagine in your mind, but I'm going to click this. And now picture it being something like this. But now picture this is as thin as a piece of paper, right? As thin as a piece of tracing paper. Okay? This allows me to get my RGB and ground signal in here onto these, and then here are my resistors. You don't see them here because I didn't pick a 3D model for them, but this is where my RGB LEDs would go. And, you know, I used a digital caliper to measure out all these dimensions, get them sized correctly. And, you know, I'm not going to show you guys here how I did that. I may do it in the future, but lo and behold, I actually had these printed using a company called JLC PCB. And, you know, it takes about 4 weeks for them to ship them over. I'm going to turn you guys here so you can see. Here is the box it comes in, okay? Here is what we have as what comes in the box. Got a couple of them falling out of the bag. But essentially, here is my circuit board that I designed that can house these LEDs. And look how thin this is. This is so thin that the system can't even feel it. You know, you know, the circuit, the actual buttons. The carbon pads can go through these holes. So this is actually really cool. Now, here is one of these switches, okay? I bought an extra one a long time ago. It was probably about $60. I may have gotten it used. I don't remember. But what we're going to do is we're going to open this up. Now, I use this metal spudger tool to give myself the access inside. Don't bend too hard. Don't break it. So here is what it looks like. Now, the first thing you're going to notice about this is, well, wait, Steve, yours is flat. There's no components on it. Well, that's because I already desoldered them, right? So if we look here, here is where my resistors were. Sorry, this is where my capacitors were, those two leveling capacitors. Out here was where my LEDs were. Okay, if I come over here, I add again my capacitors, my LEDs, and these were my big resistors. So you can see I desoldered all of those, and it creates this flat surface, other than these two nubs here, that allows us to use this as a surface. Now, after desoldering these, just to be crystal clear, what I did was I reconnected this. I put this whole switch configuration back in the car, and I checked, does this still work? And yes, all of these buttons still work with no problem. So all of those components that sit on the top of this circuit board are related only to the illumination system. That's great. That means all of these, now here are those two resistors I referred to earlier, these two big black ones that were also powering the LED. I'm not going to take those off. But all of these little components here, that's actually related to the function of the actual switch. I won't get into the resistance level. That's for another video. You guys can research that. But long story short, now I have a flat, smooth surface that I can put this on. Now, I went through a couple iterations. This is version 3, but look, what we have here is this little mounting hole and this mounting hole up here. I lined it up with this, and if I put this on, we can see that all of my holes in here actually line up. They allow the pads, these blue pads, when you press the button, to actually make contact with the original circuit board. So I'm going to take this. Now, don't mind there's a couple holes in here that I cut, and I'll explain to you why in a minute. But when I push this down on here, those buttons actually go through and they press the buttons. Once again, at this point, I stopped, I reassembled this, and I put it in the car to make sure all of those buttons made contact, and they do. My measurements were pretty solid. Now, you might ask, Steve, why did you do it like this? Why this very thin strip and then this thickness over here? Two reasons. One, I didn't want, like the osmium, to go over these nubs on the side. And if you look here in the front, this notch is already pre-cut. This notch already exists. It's pre-cut into this. So if I were to take this and reassemble this, it's probably not going to reassemble because I flipped it and all my little things came out. So now you guys are going to watch me put these back in. 1, 2. Don't be like me. Don't flip this over once you put these in, because then you're going to have to put them back out. Okay. And one more. Here it is. Be very careful. If it falls in this hole, you got to flip it unless you have tweezers. So anyway, I'm going to put this in like this. And look at that. It popped right in. My buttons are just as responsive as ever. Right? Nothing pushing. And you can see here, the ribbon cable slips right out through that notch that's already there. Okay? So it's perfect. And it lines up with the connector here. So I'm going to have one connector here. And then I'm going to have a soldered separate connector up here, which powers the LED, which will go through the clock spring and whatnot. But this is how you get to this point. Now, okay, the question may come, all right, Steve, you've gotten pretty far. That's pretty cool. What about the actual LEDs? What about putting them on? Well, luckily for you guys, I already have a prototype that I've put together here. which is this. So I'm going to try to zoom in here so you guys can see, because this is small. Right now I'm at 5 times magnification for just for reference. Here's my earbud for my ear. This is the size of these components. Okay, now I'm going to do a 10 times zoom so you can actually see the size of the resistor, right, compared to an earbud. This is the LED. Next to it is the resistor that powers and controls the level of intensity. So here is my circuit board. I'm going to zoom back out for you guys here. And what I've done to the side here is I've set up a breadboard with my PWM modulators to do some testing, right? Let's actually test to see if this works. Okay, so I soldered on my JST connector on the end, right? Now, again, I don't know if this is how I'm going to do it when it's finally complete, but this is how it is for now. So let me make sure my connector is all set up here. So essentially each one of these is going to be a separate color. And we'll see if we can get this set up without everything fighting me. Maybe I could put this over here so it's a bit easier. Let me move this yellow one. Sorry, it's actually green. Okay, I'm sorry, that's blue. Okay, so this whole thing does not want to stay together. Red. Green. Blue. All right, I will try to hold this as best I can. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to plug this in. We're going to do a quick test so you guys can see if this works or not. So we're going to turn on green. We have green. We're going to turn on red, and it turns yellow as expected. We'll turn off the green so you can see it turns red. Okay, then we'll turn on blue. It should turn pink, then like a purplish. We'll turn off red. We're back to blue. And then finally, we'll turn them all on, maximum intensity, and we should get a white color, which is what we get. Okay, so now we know in practice the flex cable works. Okay, so let's turn all this off. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pop this out. Now, one of these days I will share a video of actually soldering this. I'm probably going to share it with the other switch. But now what we can do is we can actually test this out in the actual case. So the issue with this now is when you pop your rubber on, your rubber is designed for smaller LEDs, and to be quite honest, I didn't get the location 100% perfect. So what I'm doing, and what I started doing before I decided to record this, is I've started to cut out shapes from this rubber pad so that the LEDs actually fit snugly in. Because what was happening is, and what you sort of have to remember is this. On a microscopic scale, this square here is not just every color combined. It's something like this. Okay, I have red, blue, green. And I'm simplifying this, but this is, for the most part, this is how it actually looks. If you have thick rubber or something that is covering, let's say this, that means even if you have all 3 colors on, so you want to get a white LED, you're really going to get something that's more of like a blue and green being mixed together, right? A cyan color. Or if it's this side and you want green and red, which is going to give you orange, what you're probably going to end up with something that's, or sorry, green and red will give you yellow, I believe. The issue is you're going to end up with something a little bit more orange or red because you're blocking the green, right? So what I found was that when I started doing this, because my LEDs were not, A, not the same size, but B, not lined up perfectly, this pad needed to be, what I decided to do was cut some of the rubber out. So I already did 3 of them. And then, like I said, that's when I decided to do the video here. So I'm just going to finish up cutting one of my last ones here. And you can see I'm just using a scalpel here, a pretty sharp tool, so that I don't ruin the rubber. And I'm just trying to just gently cut, almost like you're cutting, not a steak, because I'm not sawing, but just kind of stabbing, right? Trying to cut like a spaghetti, if you will. And then I pull to see, like, okay, where did I not cut it through all the way? What do I need to change about what I'm doing? Okay, slice, slice. And then maybe I'll do, don't pull too hard because you don't want to actually tear this rubber. You cannot buy these rubbers on their own. And so you'll end up in a situation where you need to spend another $60 to buy a whole new switch just to get the rubber pad. All right, I'm just trying to get this last little piece off here. And honestly, with a magnifier, it would probably be a little bit easier to see what I'm actually missing. But, so, there we are. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see how this matches up with our actual LEDs. So if we were to overlay this, sort of there, right? We have these 2 on the bottom, and then up here we kind of have this one. This one looks like it needs a little more because the LED is a little bit lower. So let's take that off. Let's take a little bit more off of this one on the bottom side. And then let's see how this ends up fitting. So again, look, I'm just little push in, little push, because I don't want to tear anything unnecessarily. Okay, we're going to try this again. We're going to put this on. All right, we're going to pop this on. And for the most part, this looks like it is, again, in much better shape. Now, my intent is not to make this perfect. My intent is not to make it, actually, this one could use a little bit more. So let's take care of that one. I'm not too happy about how I'm really stressing that one out. Now, in a later design, perhaps this will get a little bit better, but the issue is I only need one of these. You only need one of these. We all really only need one, and I'm not going to go through 100 iterations just to try to get one perfect. So let's try this again. The other thing is, when you solder on your own LEDs, they're not going to come out exactly in the middle of the design. So here we are. So now you can see we have the LED, the LED, the LED. I'll zoom in here so you guys can see it better. We have our rubber pad on here. Okay, and these are in roughly the same spot the original ones were as well. Okay, this was originally the ice blue LED. And this here was originally where the ice blue LEDs were. These were the resistors, and these were the capacitors. Okay, so now we have this pretty solidly in. Let's grab this. We're not going to flip it. All these will fall out again, so we're going to flip this very gently, because this cable is not invincible. We don't want it to tear. Okay, so now we have a light switch. We have the LEDs in there. We have our buttons feel nice and smooth, so they should work, meaning I did, you know, this thing didn't shift, and it shouldn't, because I did put those mounting holes in. And now what we're going to do is we're going to test out the switch with our breadboard. Now, once again, this fell out, so I am going to have to find a way to make this a smoother process. Perhaps, let me do this. Let me take off a little bit more of these wires. Okay, so perhaps this will allow them to stay a little bit more stiff in the board. One. Okay, this is red. Zoom out so you guys can actually see what I'm doing. Now, remember, all of this for me is proof of concept. So I am going to be testing everything just about every step of the way. You guys may not have to do that if you just take what I learned and just put it into practice. All right. This is just not cooperating. Anyway, now that that's plugged in, the irony that this is the part that is causing me the biggest headache. All right, let's assume for a second that's in. We have our switch. Let's turn off our light so we get a more solid view. Let's try green. All right. And listen, you guys can't really tell. There may be some lens flare, but this does not appear super bright, so it's not like it's going to be blinding in the car. So we have green, we have blue. That does appear blue on the screen. It looks a little purple, but it's definitely blue, and our red. And again, that red may look a little orange to you guys, but it's definitely red. Let's go with some blue in that, okay? So we're at a little bit of a pinkish purple. Let's take our red out. Let's get our green in there. Okay, we're at like an ice bluish magenta color. And if we take green out, sorry, blue out, or green, with red, it turns an almost yellow color, and it's consistent. What's important is that it's consistent. When I first did this, what was happening was I was getting yellow here, and then yellow here, and an orangey color on this one. And I think it's because of that rubber thing was not doing a good job of allowing all of the light through. So now I'll just turn on green all the way, turn on blue all the way, and make sure red is all the way on, and that's where I get my crispy white ice, my sort of icy white color. So that's it. I mean, again, from your perspective on the screen here, it probably looks like it's bright and washing out the letters here, but in person, it could not be more crisp. It looks really nice. It doesn't look like there's a lot of wash through of color and whatnot. So I really like how it's coming out. My understanding is if you want it to be a little bit dimmer, I believe you just increase the value of your resistors on each line. That will dampen the intensity. It's not as simple as just decreasing the resistance to increase the brightness. You could end up burning out your LEDs. But guys, that is how, in practice, this is done. Now, I have not yet done the other side switch. So here is the left side switch. All I've done so far is I've done a prototype of designing this. So I'll pop this so you guys can see. You can see here, I've desoldered the existing LEDs and resistors from the board so it's smooth. Okay, that's what all these little gray spots are, the pads. And then I created my prototype. And if we look here, once again, all of my pads show through. And they have a lot of real estate here showing through, which allows me to, which will allow me to have a lot of contact when I press my buttons. So more to come. In the next episode, I'm going to probably show you guys how I solder all of this on. So all of these little components. Because it does appear like there's a lot. It's not as much as it may seem, but there's a decent amount. And then what we'll do is we'll go through how do we cut this rubber thing to allow those LEDs to show through. Again, assuming you did your homework, assuming I did my homework, because you know, I probably will end up, well, I don't know. I may release these blueprints if I feel like they're good enough. But when we layer this on top, if we look closely enough, we can sort of make out that LED is where it belongs. Okay, that one is in the middle, right? You can see the LED pads almost directly beneath these dark spots where the LEDs would have been, the original LEDs, right? So we'll work through that in another episode. At this point, some of my things are actually popping out, which is causing the color to go a little kooky, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, guys, I will catch you in the next one. Take care.